All right, welcome everybody. People are still filing in, but I'm going to go ahead and get started because we want to stay on time. So please come on in, take your seat. I am Jessica Kemp, Vice President of CPEX, and I'm really excited to be introducing our panel. It's getting hot in here, planning for extreme heat. I need to make some housekeeping announcements. I want to let everyone know that this session is approved for continuing education legal credits. Attorneys should have received a CLE form at check-in. If you didn't, there's a table in the foyer where you can get your documents. Planners, landscape architects, and lead professionals may also receive credit. Also go to that continuing education table in the lobby. I want to thank our session sponsor, the Louisiana Department of Health and Well Ahead, as well as all the summit sponsors who are listed in your program. The summit would not be possible without their support. Okay. So we're gearing up for another very hot summer here in Baton Rouge, and I feel like I'm still recovering from the last one. Last summer, I heard a lot of people say things like, it's always hot in Louisiana, which is true, but this is different. Records for high temperatures and heat waves are being broken at an alarming rate, and we are feeling the impacts in our pocketbooks, our food systems, our infrastructure, and our health. The American Planning Association recently released a report stating that we must urgently plan our cities to better support equitable thermal comfort in communities today and in the future. And they identified this as one of the most important issues for planners to address as communities across the United States get hotter. I'm sure most of you know that heat is already the #1 weather-related killer in the United States, so we have good cause to take these admonitions very seriously. I'm very glad to have this panel of experts with us today to provide clarity on what heat projections look like for Louisiana, the tools and resources available to support heat mitigation and adaptation strategies, and some great examples of innovative on-the-ground efforts that have proven successful. So, many of you may know our first panelist, Barry Keim. He's the Richard J. Russell Professor in the Department of Geography and Anthropology at Louisiana State University. His research focuses on climatic extremes, and he is an expert in matters concerning climatic data and its interpretation. He also serves as the LSU director of a NOAA-funded research program called the Southern Climate Impacts Planning Program. We also have Robert Seaman with us. Robert is a natural resources specialist in urban and community forestry with the U.S. Forest Service. He is also a practicing urban forester and an ISA certified arborist with academic backgrounds in traditional forestry as well as landscape architecture. Before working for USDA Forest Service, he served as Baton Rouge Green's Director of Operations as well as Louisiana Community Forest State Coordinator. And all the way from California, we have Brent Bucknam, the founder of Hyphae Design Lab, an Oakland-based multidisciplinary engineering and innovation firm started in 2008. Brent has been a leader in urban environmental engineering field for nearly 2 decades, developing iconic, innovative, and impactful green infrastructure projects throughout the country. So thanks to all of you for being here today, and we're going to start with Barry to tell us what is going on with extreme heat in Louisiana.
Thank you, Jessica. Much appreciated. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation to be able to talk to you about Louisiana. Basically, the canary in the climate coal mine is the way I like to think about it. Some of you may be familiar with me. I'm the former state climatologist for Louisiana. I was recently fired. Thank you very much. And I'm embracing that. So anyway. With that, okay, I got to figure out how to advance my slides, which I think that'll do it. Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's start off with the global temperature curve. When we talk about heat, we know the globe is heating, and this is the best estimate that we were able to put together for what the globe's temperature has looked like going back to 1850. And so we're 1850 all the way on your far left-hand side, going to the last full complete year, 2023. And you can see a pretty distinct pattern toward increasing temperatures as we move through time, especially since about 1900. I mean, the pattern is pretty striking. There's lots of interpretations of what's driving all the changes in this slide, but it's pretty well accepted and assumed that greenhouse gases are playing a very significant role. Now, obviously, some of this could be natural as well. In my very biased opinion, there's probably some combination of both. But the anthropogenic signal seems to be becoming clearer through time. Okay, and another thing I want to point out, let me get back to the previous slide here just for a sec, if I can. I also just want to point out that 2023 was indeed the warmest year on record, and it's not close. And it's a combination of climate change, obviously, compounded with the El Nino event that's still kind of ongoing. But anyway, I just want you to notice this temporal pattern going back to about 1900 or so, that, obviously very cool back in this period in time, and with a, it's not quite monotonic, obviously, but a pretty clear trend toward increasing temperatures. Now, I want to contrast that with, this is the Louisiana temperature curve. So how has Louisiana's temperature changed? Now, this only goes back to 1895, whereas the previous graphic went back to 1850. But nevertheless, we get a pretty interesting story being told. First and foremost, 2023, yes, the warmest year on record. But what's interesting is that the Louisiana temperature curve does not follow the global pattern very well at all, despite the fact that 2023 was warmest. In fact, these years back in the teens and 20s, we had some of the hottest years on record for the state, whereby globally that was clearly not the case. We had very coolish temperatures for the whole globe during that time period. So so obviously Louisiana doesn't necessarily parallel what's happening over the rest of the globe. So let's talk about the summer from hell. That was last summer, 2023. What we're looking at right here, this is data for Baton Rouge, and we're looking at the number of days where the morning temperature was above 80 degrees. That's the minimum temperature for the day. Most days drop below 80 degrees, and even throughout the summer months. And as you look at this, you can see in the first several decades of this thing, not a single morning, for decades, did the minimum temperature stay above 80 degrees. That just didn't happen. Then we get a smattering of these, through the years. Most years, obviously, not having any, but some years will have one or two. And then as we get into the 2000s, notice that they become much more common. And then we have 2023, where I can't quite read the number, but I believe it's 27 or 28 days, the mornings were above 80 degrees. That's total insanity, okay? Similarly, this is also Baton Rouge. These are the number of days above 100 degrees, 100 or over. We hardly ever get to 100 degrees here in Baton Rouge. Looking at this, back into the 1930s, most years get none. Every now and then we'll get a year that'll have one, or you get a little heat outbreak, if you will. You might get 4 or 5 of them. Usually those occur almost in a row. And then all of a sudden we have 2023, where we have this absurd number of days over 100 degrees. Again, if going into the summer, if somebody told me that we were going to get, over 20 days over 100 degrees, I would have said it's physically impossible, just to show you what I know about weather and climate, right? Maybe that's why I got fired, but that's a whole other thing. So anyway, but you get the general idea of just how absurd 2023 was. Now this I put up here for a specific reason. This is the number of days exceeding 95. Now, as you can see, the difference between 95 and 100 is stark, okay? When we get into those upper 90s, normally what we do, we have so much moisture and humidity here that we normally, get what we call the rising thermals. They produce clouds, which ultimately, blocks the sun. You get a rainstorm, and that cools the surface down. So, we hardly ever see 100, but we do get into the mid-90s pretty frequently, and that's pretty obvious here. And you can also see just how anomalous 2023 was relative to all these other years. But the thing I want to point out, the average number of days at 95 or above probably averages out at about 20 per year, actually, in this case. Most of those obviously are in the summer, but it's about 20 per year. And I say that because this is what the projections look like for 95 degrees moving forward, and this is in the number of days added to what's already happening, change in the number of days at or above 95. If you look at Louisiana, we're looking at between 30 and 40 additional days at 95 or above, whereby is now we're only averaging about 20. So we're going to be more than doubling that probably moving forward, okay, or something to that effect. So it's pretty obscene what the models are suggesting what heat stress is going to look like. And also keep in mind, I mean, I have a student right now working on whether humidity is changing across the Southeast, and rest assured it is, okay? So humidity is going up, compounding all this, and you put those two together and look at heat indices, you'd see similar patterns and maybe even enhanced patterns. So some of the work I'm doing right now is with the Louisiana Department of Health, and we're trying to understand what are the trigger points that drive people into emergency rooms with heat stress. So this is a data set that they put together over this past year. This is 2023, okay, starting on April 1st through the end of October. And what they asked us to do at LSU was to put together a temperature time series for the state. And so what this red line here is, that is the average high temperature for each day for that period from April through October. Okay, so this is the average high temperature for the entire state of Louisiana, and then the blue bars represent the total number of emergency room visits within the state of Louisiana. Got it. And what you can see is there's a pretty stark relationship. I mean, and you can see, the first one of the, we get this rise in these average temperatures up over, 90 degrees and into the hundreds. You can see this first big spike. Temperatures continue to increase, but as we get deeper into the season, more mitigation factors start to get put in place. And there's also this sort of non-politically correct term called harvesting, I guess, that earlier in the season, more people succumb to these kinds of issues than you do deeper in the season. So two of those things ongoing there. And this just takes those same data, and you can see the number of emergency room visits here versus the daily maximum temperature. When the maximums are in the 70s, 80s, and between the 60s, 70s, and 80s, just a very gradual increase in people going to emergency rooms. But when you get to about 88 degrees, all of a sudden this thing just skyrockets and goes berserk. And that's when people start hitting the emergency room. So that seems to be the trigger point, right around 88 degrees or so. And looking at some hurricane information, how are hurricanes being impacted? Well, this is some work originally done by the Colorado State group that I took and actually worked these data up and did a little more with it. But what we're doing here is comparing and contrasting sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic versus global temperatures. This is the global temperature curve, and this compares two time periods. First one here has warm sea surface temperatures in the breeding grounds, but yet global temperatures are certainly way less than where they are now. And we compare that with relatively cool sea surface temperatures with much higher global temperatures compared to the base period here. This shows all the Category 3, 4, and 5 hurricane tracks. This is warm sea surface temperatures, but cool global temperatures, okay? Notice how active that is. This is cool sea surface temperatures, warm global temperatures, not nearly as active. Take-home message to me, sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic are way more important than anything going on in the globe regarding hurricanes. And this is a chart we put together based on a database that we built called SurgeDat. These are the highest surges recorded across Louisiana, and a couple of take-home messages. One, the two biggest surges ever measured in the Gulf of Mexico, Katrina and Camille, 28, 24.6 feet respectively. But what's really interesting is of these top 10, 5 of them have occurred since 2005, and this data set goes back to 1880. Okay, that certainly suggests something is amiss, something is happening, and whether it's climate related or whether it's structural with the levee systems and things of that nature that are exacerbating the surges, I don't really have the answers to that, but it is an interesting chart. And just a few slides. I got 2 minutes. So I'll just show you a few. I like to have some real-world slides here. This is Chalmette, where I grew up in the throes of Hurricane Katrina's flood. All you're seeing are the rooftops of houses poking out of the floodwaters. This is the lower 9th Ward, the infamous barge. And this is damage in Lake Charles from Hurricane Laura. And sadly, correct me if I'm wrong, but Capital One building still pretty much looks like this. In fact, maybe even a little worse. But I think things should start loosening up a little bit. Hopefully, we get some of this repaired. But I will end on this slide because I'm just about out of time. PowerPoint 101, never put up a slide with a bazillion numbers, right? But I love this slide, and I want you to love it too, okay? So work with me. Just a point I want to make here. This is a depth area duration table for Hurricane Harvey in southeastern Texas, okay? And at a 35,000 square mile area, moving over here to 120 hours, okay, 5 days of rainfall over 35,000 square miles, comes out at 22.5 inches of rainfall. 35,000 square miles is about the size of South Carolina. So think about putting 22.5 inches of rain, not in a point in South Carolina, everywhere in South Carolina, across the entire state. That's what happened during Hurricane Harvey. And then lastly, well, let me go back to that real quick. And then for over a 2,000 square mile area, that's about the size of Delaware, okay, to put it in perspective, we're looking at 42.2 inches of rainfall over the whole state. Again, not a point, the entire state, and what kind of havoc that could reach. I'm going to stop there.
Can I use the other mic so I don't have to stay behind the podium? I'm just not very good at. Sorry, I had ADHD as a child, so I'm not very good at standing behind the podium. My name is Brent Bugnam. I'm from Hyphy Design Laboratory. We're based in West Oakland, California, but we work all over the country. West Oakland is a community, for me, part of the reason I'm getting into my community is we don't have an extreme heat problem, unlike you guys. We could use a little more heat up in Oakland, but we are embattled by many environmental justice issues in our community, and I think extreme heat is one of those, you know, both impacting urban communities as well as a lot of rural farm working communities. So I wanted to show sort of our approach and our technology, and part of our technology is people. And so I think I want to talk about my own story first for a minute, and then tell you a project that we're working on in Dallas, primarily around heat. So if you're wondering why I'm talking about air quality first, it all relates. So in West Oakland, we're surrounded by freeways, a port, waste treatment plants. I, early on when I moved to West Oakland in 2008, quickly met my neighbor, Miss Margaret Gordon. You can see her on a really good day in front of City Hall after she's gotten some policy, on a not so good day when she's pissed off at the EPA for not regulating. So she's been an amazing organizer and influencer for me. She started also as a house cleaner. She was actually cleaning house for someone who ran the Sierra Club. So she just started collecting magazines from the house, taking what he had, books, and educated herself on environmental justice issues over 40 or 50 years. First woman, first black woman, first community member elected to the Port of Oakland Commission. So Miss Margaret was in the process of fighting, or helping fight, to clean up a Superfund site that happened to be in my backyard. So I showed up at a meeting, and she found out that I was involved in remediation and environmental engineering. This was about 15 years ago, and has not let me go since. So Miss Margaret lived over here. I lived in the middle, and this is the Superfund site right here. And that was also where our office was at the time. The interesting thing, sorry, let me go back. Superfund site, when they're doing cleanups, they actually look at background data, sort of like how polluted is this site and how polluted is the surrounding environment. We basically said we would be one of the subjects to come sample our yard. Turns out the pollution in my yard was 10 times worse than the Superfund site. So this caused an interesting issue for the EPA, because they're often like, oh, we're coming in and cleaning up this really bad problem right here. But actually the problem is universal. And it's not universal, actually. It's universal in poor, low-income communities like the one that I live in. And so for us, we said, let's come up with an emergency response plan. Let's clean up the yards where kids are playing in our neighborhood before we clean up the Superfund site. But unlike a lot of other communities, we said, you know, we don't want to haul off this lead to another community, most likely a Native American reservation, because that's what's happened to us for much of our history. So we wanted to come up with a new solution. We worked with the EPA and actually an artist who tried some of this work, Mel Chin in New Orleans, to use phosphate. By tilling phosphate from fish bones into the soil, we can immobilize the lead, which then basically makes it biounavailable if a child or someone is to eat it. Processes through their system and doesn't bond with the blood or fat. So for us, this was a model, right? This isn't extreme heat, but it's a model of how to make change in a community through partnering with environmental justice groups, community members, and then technical experts like ourselves. We partnered to create a project called Adapt Oakland. For us, this was to say, how do we tackle more issues in our community, like air pollution, through a similar lens, where we can use adaptive management, often coming from forestry, other systems where we might not know the outcome, but we can constantly be doing analysis, design, implementing projects, monitoring how effective they are, evaluating them, and constantly adapting. For us, this is also an economic goal. We see if we can mitigate some pollution, we want to then figure out how to get paid to do that so we can return that money to the community. So in our community, this was back in 2008, 2009, we had over 1 million missed school days, 360 missed work days due to air pollution. This is even worse for extreme heat. 75% of the pollution was coming from the port, 20 to 40% is coming from brake and tire wear. So even if you got that Tesla, it's got a heavy battery. So we imagined this idea of like, how can we actually use green infrastructure to return people to school, reduce sick days, save money? The big challenge is in our community, and like everywhere now, we're given tools like EnviroScreen. It was very innovative in California. Now it's used to give out money all over the country. The problem is that these tools are problematic. They're based on census tracts. In our case, you know, no one actually even lives out here, but that's where all the pollution comes from. A lot of people live in here, and this is also pollution. These don't really tell us what's going on. And one of the core problems of using things like census tracts to try to solve environmental justice problems is that these political boundaries are the drivers of most of the problem to begin with redlining. So these are extremely problematic. So what we found is we really need to get down to data and spatial conditions, not political census tracts or county boundaries. And we need to tease out the information for people. 70% of our pollution comes from the ships, but 70% of the cancer comes from the trucks that are actually next to people due to proximity. So we need to separate out these issues between carbon issues, kind of global warming, which is important, versus human health issues. And those are two distinct issues we need to tackle, and often people are trying to pack everything into a carbon model. So for us, we needed to start modeling where are the trucks going and who are they exposing. We then worked with Environmental Defense Fund and Google and Aclima to drive cars with pollution data to get hyper-local pollution. You can start to see in this corner of the neighborhood one of the highest levels of pollution. What we then saw was literally 2 blocks away from each other, working with Kaiser Permanente, West Oakland Environment Indicators, and EDF found that 2 blocks away, there was a 30% difference in health, premature heart disease, premature death, and this is due to literally 3 blocks away from each other and statistical information for comparable populations. So these issues that we're facing, guys, are extremely hyper-local, and that's what we need to get to. From this, we're able to take what would be historical kind of large county-level models and really hone in on specific impacts that are causing that pollution. And we need to do this because it's really expensive to do urban infrastructure, and we need to target the interventions. So we're actually working on an intervention in this community where we're modeling the environment, we're modeling pollution in the environment, we're looking at where that pollution drifts over time. Sadly, it's drifting right at that house, that affordable housing complex, so it starts to explain things. There's a new affordable housing complex getting built, so we're able to work and say, what can we do through models to actually change the air conditions downwind of that? I think modeling is a really important tool for us because we can simulate many different scenarios into the future at a really local scale and really optimize the strategies before we build them, spend millions of dollars in communities. We can look at sort of pollution wind dynamics. We can understand that like not all trees are created equal. If we have really dense trees, they're going to perform a lot differently than really porous trees as far as removing pollution. A lot of people are talking about tree equity and canopy. I think that's not really helpful. There's a lot, I can get into that, but I don't have time. So our model is really around modeling the problems, modeling the solutions, designing them, building them, and then monitoring it again, and repeating this. And so we've been doing this with a bunch of partners across the country, and people have been excited about it. So we've gotten funding from the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, other grants locally to sort of turn these into tools that more people can use. And the reality is we try to simplify it, but it's actually a complex problem of like health and environmental conditions and how people move around. And at the end of the day, it's really expensive to do this work. And the problem is that we want to work with environmental justice communities, and they don't have the money to pay us to do what we need to do. So what we've been doing is analyzing how much time we spend doing stuff that we don't need to do, and how can we reduce the cost of our work, shifting from more of a consulting model to more of a software and community-driven model. So in many cases, we're finding we can remove 70, 80% of our cost if we automate the processes that we've been doing. So what we're building is a platform that really empowers communities for them to take control, determine their own future, design evidence-based solutions. We can kind of compress the expense of working with engineers, academics, epidemiologists, and really try to streamline that. We're now working with folks a number of places around the country. What we found too is people don't want dashboards. They want to see solutions. And so I'm just going to jump through because I'm running out of time, but we're working, for example, in Boyle Heights, and our approach is to train and give community members, in this case 95% Latino community, the tools to do the work themselves. And so I'm going to finally now present just the one case study on extreme heat. I want to thank David Whitley, who's here, who's partner on this project, for inviting us. So David's planner on the project. This is a medical district in Dallas. All right, 5, I can do that. Medical district in Dallas. And when we try to look at changing these communities, a lot of people don't realize that they've changed a lot in the last 100 years. This used to be wetlands and farmland. Now it's, one of the hottest industrial and medical corridors. And this is a heat island map of the community. The challenge, similar to the other projects, is that you really can't do anything with these broad maps like this. Even when we zoom in and use like land surface temperature, the problem is this won't actually measure the difference of a tree that I plant or a road that I paint because the resolution's low. And so when we're really looking at interventions, this helps us pinpoint problems, but to look at interventions, we really need to zoom down and use new tools. So what we're doing is we're putting out measuring equipment, we're using modeling and simulations, and then modifying the environment. Don't need to tell you guys or people in Dallas about how oppressive the heat is here, but one thing that people might not know is this sort of feels like condition that's often shown on weather stations is really not just the air temperature, because some people say it's 90 degrees out, but as you all know, it depends on the wind speed and the humidity, and all of these things actually drive how comfortable we are or how quickly we'll become stressed. So what we do is we deploy sensors throughout the neighborhood that have these variables, radiant heat, wind speed, and so on and so forth. Then we build simulation models so we can simulate a day, a month, a year, and we calibrate the models with the sensors. In this case, we're working with Texas Trees Foundation and David and field operations, landscape architect, and Kimley Horn, engineers, to redesign a 3-mile strip. What we're able to do is sort of model the before and after conditions. We say we might be able to reduce literally 9 degrees Celsius in some of these, which is extremely high for people who know what that is. And so we're also able to zoom in and iterate on design strategy. So this is a new park that's getting planned in the middle. And we're able to take the existing conditions, use tools to model and look at different zones within the corridor and say okay, what's the wind speed and temperature at different places? And we can actually create these simulations within the park, for example, where what you're really seeing is sort of the evapotranspiration coming off the trees. We can start to really model and understand what's happening at a microclimate scale. What we learning when we look at these wind fields at this microscopic scale is wind's not just going in one direction. When we've got tall buildings, it gets forced through, you create vortices. And what we're finding is actually where you have strong winds, you don't want to plant a lot of trees because that wind is great. It's cooling you down. But where you have kind of eddies and darker areas, you want to plant trees because there's less wind moving through and it can actually cool the space under it. So the big takeaways are that we don't have uniform conditions in our environment. And so different conditions will benefit from tree planting or increasing wind speed. We need to really look at it at a microclimate level. Similarly, sadly, in August, I can't do much for you guys with green infrastructure here. It's just awful. You should stay inside. And I wish that wasn't the takeaway. No. But I think in those cases, we do need to realize it's not safe to be outside, even with tons of trees, until we sort of change the macroclimate. But there's people like farm workers who can't go inside. And so the big takeaway, though, is in the fall and spring, we can actually do a lot of change. The difference between where you are under a tree versus otherwise is complex. So I'm showing you this. I got 2 minutes. I think I can get there. But this is essentially the complex modeling that happens. Don't need to understand it, but we build a digital twin, literally like a digital model of the world that exists there. We model the trees, we model the porosity of all those trees, we measure their porosity, we use Street View to measure their shape, put out the sensors, use the sensors to calibrate the model. We get really different conditions when we put these sensors under a tree or under, for example, a bus stop. Bus stops are actually awful places to be normally because there's no wind flow and no shade. Big takeaway we're finding is we're not actually finding a statistical difference between an exposed condition and a newly planted tree. We really don't get these beneficial shade effects until we get mature trees, 15, 20, 30 years old. So major takeaway is please don't cut the trees down. We can try planting more, but they're not effective. So we process all that data, simulate the models, improve the models, make the designs. In this case, we can look at a bunch of different iterations of designs and say which one's going to have the best thermal impact. Removing these trees is going to make it hotter. Planting new ones will make it cooler. Where is the shade actually getting cast at this kind of microclimate scale? And since I have little time, I'm going to take 1 minute if that's acceptable. So basically, the real important thing is coming back to people, right? It doesn't matter where, if it's hot in a place where no one is. So a lot of our work is then looking at what routes are people taking, essentially, and how do we cool those routes efficiently rather than cooling everywhere. And we can start to calculate sort of people's temperature along those routes and sort of when they would actually overheat, starting to tackle some of the issues of when are we hitting those heat stress. So I'm going to stop there, but thank you.
I'd like to thank the technical staff for bailing me out. I gave them a thumb drive with a very old presentation on it, so thank you guys. I'm Robert Seaman. I'm with the U.S. Forest Service. I work for the Washington Office of Urban and Community Forestry. And in this presentation, I'd like to just give you guys a little overview of our organization, how we're aware and how we understand urban heat as it's evolving and what we're doing about it, and hopefully leave you guys with some resources that you can take away from this in your practice. As I said before, I'm with the Washington office. I do work and live here in Louisiana. That's just how the Forest Service is organized. And the important note here is that our unit is within the cooperative forestry unit. That means we work directly with state governments, local governments, nonprofit organizations, boots on the ground entities, anyone we can work with who has local knowledge, innovation, and expertise that we can leverage. So that's one of the big things our office likes to do. You'll see a lot of regional programs come out through the Forest Service, and then every state in this country has its own urban and community forestry program that's run by, typically it's run by your state ag agency. Ours happens to be run by Baton Rouge Green. If you're looking for local technical assistance, these state urban and community forestry coordinators are your best point of contact. I'm going to say that a few times throughout this. So at the national level, we stand up an Urban and Community Forestry Advisory Council that guides our long-term planning. They're the ones that put together the 10-year UCF action plans. We offer national cost share challenge grants. You guys may have heard of the Inflation Reduction Act. We just put over $1 billion out there directly to communities to help out with issues they're having with the urban forest. We do research and development, and we also have technology and science delivery. At that regional level, we're in the southern region. So the southern region puts base funding into your state community forestry program, and that's what leads to the technical and financial assistance. So if you're looking to do an inventory, if you're looking to do something to mitigate heat in your area, if you're looking for technical solutions or funding, go through your state coordinator and see what's available. We know it's getting hotter, right? Heat is the #1 killer in this country for weather-related events. Increasing temperatures typically coincide with your community having an increased risk level. You're going to have more tornadoes, you're going to have more climate events, you're going to have more severe thunderstorms, you're going to suffer more drought. So the risk rating in your community, it's not just FEMA that does this, all kinds of organizations assign risk ratings to communities. That coincides with heat. Increasing temperatures really make it hard to grow urban trees. And we know that heat disproportionately affects our vulnerable communities. If you live in an area that has a robust urban canopy, it's going to be 11 to 19 degrees cooler in the summertime than an area with no urban canopy, okay? There's a dual nature to trees. They're a mitigating effect to heat, but they're also extremely vulnerable to the effects of increased heat. I like big trees, and I cannot lie. Y'all heard, seriously, y'all heard Brent, those baby trees, they don't do any more good than a cell phone tower. So it's not enough to cut down trees and replant trees. We need to think about conserving large trees or long-term strategies that cultivate and allow us to grow large trees. You don't start seeing any ecological benefits. The ecological benefits are going to be your stormwater interception, mitigating solar heat, mitigating reflective heat. Those things like that don't show up until that tree is about 10 inches in diameter. That's usually about 10 years old. That's also the time a lot of urban trees start dying because their sites aren't suitable, okay? We'll just throw some native trees at it, right? That's all we gotta do, climate adapted native trees. There ain't much native about our urban environments. Climate adaptive native species are an excellent solution, but you need to understand the microclimates like Brent was talking about that you're gonna be planting in, okay? You need to choose the right tree for the right place. And just remember, there just isn't much native that's going on in our cities. Rootable soil volumes, soil types, that reflective and radiate heat is really, really tough on deciduous trees and on flower-bearing trees. I know a lot of you, some of you may be old enough to remember when we had dogwoods everywhere. I know everyone here probably has uncles or grandparents that talk about flowering species of trees that we just don't grow in South Louisiana anymore because they die. We know that vulnerable communities are severely impacted by extreme heat conditions. We know that vulnerable communities, there's a whoa, went way too long. So what we're doing right now is trying to address climate inequity. The USDA Forest Service is covered on the Biden Justice 40 initiative. Basically, that means that everything that we're doing right now with selected investments, 40% of those investments go to disadvantaged communities. We launched our Inflation Reduction Act. We put out $1.3 billion. All that's going directly to disadvantaged communities. 43% of those applications, 43% of those funded projects are going to deal with communities, communities that specifically requested money to mitigate heat in their area with trees. We offer lots of tools at the Forest Service. We have iTree Landscape, which builds in census tract data with heat data. iTree Cool Air, that's a research tool that models increasing air temperatures based on our iTree Hydro model. technology and science delivery, I would go to this website, vibrantcities.lab. They will walk you through how to create an urban forest management plan. If you type in any keywords regarding heat, you can get lots of downloadable articles and information on urban heat islands and the effects it's having on our environment. Like I said, technical assistance, please go to your Louisiana Community Forestry State Coordinator. They're going to be the best ones to help you model a heat program using trees or advise you on how best to use trees in your urban environment to mitigate the effects of urban heat. They'll have excellent recommendations on species to use as well. You can go to our Urban Community Forestry homepage, have some information. I encourage you to check out supperlab.org. Dr. Shondas is doing incredible research in this area. I can't really talk about a lot of it right now, but it's definitely worth taking a look at his site. Also, the Vibrant Cities Lab is shown there again. Heat.gov is kind of your one-stop shop for all things heat in this country. It's kind of a clearinghouse of information. They even have a dedicated page and resources for urban heat islands to educate yourself. EPA has a lot of information and some downloadable resources. They have a compendium on addressing urban heat, and they have one of those chapters in it specifically deals with trees. These two websites really help you understand heat management or urban management through the lens of heat equity and framing your urban management plan around heat mitigating factors. The Northern Institute of Applied Climate Sciences actually has a pretty unique training program that you can do online or in person. The Forest Service Office of Sustainability and Climate, that's going to be a little more towards our national forests. It does have some stuff in there about vulnerable communities. That's going to be really big picture stuff. If you want to tinker around and see what you can do for your own community, I advise you take a look at that NAICS website. Funding opportunities, right? Money helps all these programs go. If you go to heat.gov, click on funding opportunities, EPA, NASA, HUD, and FEMA are all offering grants. I think that NASA one, you might not be able to get into that. The NOI, the notice of intent deadline is passed, but they are still accepting proposals. FEMA and HUD are on a rolling basis, and EPA is just going to do it until they're full. But our IRA notice of funding opportunity is on there as well, but that is closed. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. We've left a good bit of time for questions, so I'm counting on you, the audience, to come up with some great questions for our panelists. If you have a question, raise your hand, stand up, and a CPEXer will bring you a microphone. Thank you for your patience.
Hey y'all, good afternoon. I think at this point, my name's Amelia. I'm with Foundation for Louisiana. One of the concerns that I have with heat is not just that, older people and young people have a hard time thermoregulating. Like, yes, there's that piece. The other piece that I think is particularly relevant in Louisiana is how heat impacts how the chemicals in our environment interact with one another. And I'm very curious, and I suppose this is for you, Robert, with the Forestry Service, how are y'all thinking about how trees, whether they're young or not, are helping with that kind of impact, with the reduction of the interaction of chemicals in urban environments?
Most of the chemicals that we typically mitigate are going to be your airborne chemicals, your airborne pollutants, and your particulate matter. So we obviously we like to throw trees at any problem we have. So increasing the leaf surface area in your community, putting more trees out there is going to increase the ability to intercept more pollutants that are airborne. And that can be solid pollutants, which will then go down in the ground, and the ground's going to absorb those pollutions through rainwater and absorption there, or it can just be gaseous airborne pollutants too. So trees are kind of the natural filters and lungs of your city. So they're going to remove a lot of pollution, but we need an effective urban canopy to do that, and we need large shade trees to do that. And that that does disproportionately affect disadvantaged communities, because all those heat stressors you just named about why they can't keep cool, the reserve is the trees, right? So those areas are typically underinvested in and have either less urban canopy, or the urban canopy they have is not resilient, it's not healthy, and it's not very effective. So when you take all those other socioeconomic factors into a disadvantaged community of why they have trouble keeping cool and how it affects those vulnerable communities, you double whammy it by reducing their canopy. And then you also double whammy the health effects, because the air quality is just not as good. And we've seen that over and over again, where we have more trees and healthy canopy, you tend to have less exposure to airborne pollutants. But airborne pollutants is really the only ones that we typically address.
Yeah, go ahead. Do you have something to add, Brent?
I have ideas. Do you have anything?
I just wanted to add that, here in Baton Rouge anyway, one of our big problems is ozone.
Yeah.
And the high pressure moves in, lots of sunlight interacting with the chemicals, and that's one of our big issues here. I don't know if the trees will help that, but in some cases it may even exacerbate.
They will exacerbate some of that. Yeah.
In some cases it does exacerbate it, but the overall effect is mitigating.
Yeah. I think also as an ecologist, my goal is to do what you're saying, which is look at all the systems interacting with each other. And what a lot of the modeling we do actually uses fluid dynamics. So we're using the same models to look at heat and meteorological conditions, as well as like the pollution and deposition and chemistry that's going on. And what we're finding, maybe Louisiana is a little further behind than California, but what we're finding is tailpipe emissions are going down. Trees do have biogenic VOC emissions that can contribute to ozone when there's tailpipe emissions in conjunction with them. What we're actually finding in many places is we still have point source emissions like power plants, but with the regulations on cars, the tailpipes are becoming far less impactful, and it's really like the dust and the brake and tire wear that are becoming a bigger impact from a pollution standpoint. So I think that will go down, but also the increasing of temperature and humidity does push the VOCs up from the trees, because it's one of their ways to like combat and fight stress. But a lot of what we're doing too is then, identifying, choosing specific tree species that have lower VOCs. It's sad because some of the VOCs from trees are what smells good, right? It's like the VOCs can be a bad thing, but they can also be potpourri. So I think one thing we're finding is evergreens are a lot better, and dense evergreens, like along roadways, are much better at pollution removal, sometimes even than shade trees. And those are actually, some of them are able to withstand some of the stress better than broadleafs, depending on where you choose them from. So there's, I think, tapping into different species and really getting into the ecology, is what you were saying, is really important.
Like those evergreens, they have a broader spectrum of sites they can tolerate typically. Yeah. They're evergreen, so they're filtering air all year long, where deciduous trees aren't doing that all year long. You might not get the expansive canopy, but we are recommending those for a lot of roadside plantings. And a lot of evergreens are relatively pollution tolerant and salt tolerant in your northern areas compared to your deciduous trees.
All right, questions in the back?
Hi, my name is Chris Barnes. I'm with Scape Landscape Architect. I'm a landscape architect. I understand the concepts, some of the modeling that you were talking about, understanding the risk, understanding the benefits. But when it comes to the scale of like a resilience plan for a city, and heat is, a contributing target benefit that you're chasing, like how do you begin to model the economic benefit that might drive investment decisions, and what are the inputs for that? I guess interesting to understand that.
Yeah, and I think that's where it's, like anything we study, there's different appropriate tools for different scales and resolution, I would say. a lot of, for example, the iTree tools that the Forest Service has are good at those really broad assessments, but they're not honing in on like a lot of the microclimate dynamics, right? And so what we're often proposing is to say, like, use some of these broader tools at the city scale, and then as you find your hotspots and problem areas or work in a disadvantaged community, then like model those neighborhoods at a higher resolution scale. Or when you're going to actually do an intervention, model it at that intervention scale. Also, I think from our experience, the speed of computing is speeding up a ton, where we're working for the County of LA and doing not all of these analyses, but some of these analyses at the county scale. County of LA is larger than most states, so, or not most, but many are on the East Coast. And so I think we're getting to the point where like our computational capacity is allowing us to do complexity at scale.
Land use conditions and then scale those up as well.
Yeah, exactly.
But how do you, like from like a,
Say that again, just so others can hear it.
yeah, I would say if you have a large region or a parish or county, you could set up prototypical conditions that represent recurring themes of land use development or other patterns, and then study those at a scale, and then, you could reasonably scale that up, right?
Exactly. That's a good point. There's a lot of theory around urban climate too, that there's different kind of local climate zones that are defined by like the density of buildings. Is it a really dense urban footprint? Is it kind of spread out warehouses or suburbia? And those conditions are all going to kind of function different meteorologically. So like you're saying, you can kind of model different typologies.
And I would say too that if you're looking for practical solutions to get things going, cast a broad net. Like the Forest Service, we're really riding this first wave of research, and the stuff that Brent's doing and the more data that Barry collects, our research is going to get more refined, and we're going to have more case studies in cities and more strategies based on specific management data collection, basically. And if you look at other things you're trying to mitigate, like stormwater runoff or mitigate pollution, you start mitigating those things, you're probably going to start mitigating heat also. So look at other ecological things that you're trying to improve in your community that you have hard science on, or that maybe your Metro Council is excited about funding or voting on, and try to get your foot in the door that way. And all that's going to organically expand to reducing the heat in your community.
Me? Okay. Hi, Amelia with City of Gretna, and I just have a question about where to find data on specific tree species, because y'all have talked a little bit about it. We have about $35 million in state and federal funding that's going into green infrastructure and streetscape projects that are going to bid starting this summer. So we're working on final plans, and I'm just thinking here, like, okay, oh gosh, we have Savannah holly. Is that going to be one of the good trees? Like, we want a tree that's going to grow fast, that's maybe going to be more evergreen. Where can we go practically when we've got all these projects coming up to find the information? Because we work with a lot of wonderful landscape architects, but they're all kind of biased towards the species that they like. There's an aesthetic here, obviously, but fast-growing green infrastructure trees, where would we go to find that information for South Louisiana?
So fast growing doesn't always work well with resilient. So just remember that. And fast growing is definitely appropriate in some cases, but if you want trees that are going to stand up to hurricanes routinely, that might not be your fast growing species. So I know that New Orleans has Sol Nola, and they've got a couple of tree advocacy groups that'll have firsthand knowledge on what they're planting and why. Baton Rouge Green has some tree recommendations on their website, and they have small, medium, and large trees. So I would check out Baton Rouge Green's website. Please contact Chris Cooper, the state coordinator, and tell him exactly what you're doing, and maybe you want to run a list by him. There's nothing wrong with hollies. I used to plant a lot of hollies because sometimes that's the only space you can fit something. It is an evergreen tree. It does well with pollution. But if it's always going to be this kind of ebb and flow of benefit versus cost. The big thing is providing infrastructure. Communicate your contractors and landscape architects that you want those trees planted correctly. You want them planted in infrastructure that can support them long-term. And it's daunting because there is no definitive list. That I went there really quick, that website with the training solutions for planning through that lens of heat and heat mitigation, they do have some list. And that's part of the training. I don't feel like those lists necessarily take into account hurricanes. So that's the other thing that we're dealing with down here is it doesn't do you any good to plant something, even though it's going to thrive in this area, if its modulus of rupture dictates that that thing is going to be really ugly after the first hurricane, right? Like something missing its top or branches is not doing the job we need it to do. So we need stuff that gets big. We need to provide infrastructure that can house that. And hopefully we made a good enough species selection that it doesn't get pruned 2/3 of the way up to make room for traffic or someone's new business sign or things like that. So considering that site and how that site is used goes a long way.
And is soil volume also a driver for the hurricane issue, right? Because if you have no soil to hold on to.
Well, in urban areas, typically your growth is so truncated because of lack of rootable soil volume, or there's a massive defect in that basal part of the roots, that critical, that bottom of the wine glass, right, that holds the tree up. If you take a big bite out of the base of a wine glass, it's going to be really easy for that wine glass to tip over one way or another. And when you have things in areas they weren't designed to be, you might have a really critical defect in the support system that holds up the tree. That's a great question.
And one other resource is just Lady Bird Johnson Center has a lot of good plant material. I can tell you more from California, but they're not helpful to you. But yeah, Lady Bird Johnson's more regional, might have some of that hurricane info.
Hey, Alex Kolker from the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium and the Coastal Climates Institute. A question about, a lot of your talk on air pollution was focused around air pollution from cars and, exhausts or tires. Here in Louisiana, much of our air pollution doesn't come from cars, it comes from industry. As bad as the traffic is here in Baton Rouge, we actually don't have that many cars here, but there is a lot of industry. Exxon has a very large oil refinery just north of here that's attached to a plastics facility. When we're thinking about, pollution mitigation from trees, how does that differ in an environment where we might, instead of having lots of small sources, we have a few large sources. Those large sources are often, the smokestacks are higher up, the VOCs might be different. How do we, when we think about, pollution mitigation, what's applicable from a place where, where there's a lot of cars, and what's not applicable, what might be different?
It's a really good question. I can't help you with the trees. No, I'm joking. But I'm not also. I think the reality is there is a lot of potential where because one of the things we found in a lot of the studies we're doing, we're working with the EPA and others, the closer we get the tree to the source, so we call them point source trees, as opposed to non-point source trees spread throughout the neighborhood, we can sometimes remove like 10 times more pollutants. So an ambient tree might remove like 4% of the particulate matter. A really well-engineered buffer could remove 40. It's because you're getting it closer and the pollution's more concentrated, so you have more potential to trap it. With the smokestacks, one of the benefits is it's really high. It's getting it up into an air column that's actually having less impact on the local environment. It's obviously having all these global impacts. But one interesting study we did not participate in Houston, that has a lot of similar issues to you, was showing that in some ways, a few things like the VOCs are actually heavier. So unlike some of the light particles that are just going to kind of float up into the atmosphere, the VOCs are heavier, so they're often dropping closer to the ground. And so in that context, the trees, they did some studies in areas which had more shade canopy, were able to stop some of that because it's coming from above and dropping down on you rather than coming from the side like traffic. So I think there's ways, but ultimately let's just advocate to get better pollution control on the plants. It seems like, I'm a technologically, right? That seems like the logical thing there. The problem with road dust and cars is like, even when we go all electric conceptually, 40, 50% already of the pollution is just from dust, tire wear, kind of just kicking things things up. So until we have the Jetson cars, we're going to have that problem. And so I just think I'm a techno innovator. Like, I feel like we can develop great solutions and put them on the power plants and all work together.
I think with our projection models, like with iTree, when it looks at carbon sequestration and when it looks at the infrastructure savings you get, those are based on large plant production, right? Those are based on large point source pollutants. Anything that projects pollutants that are directly intercepted by leaves, so that's going to be your auto emissions, your things like that. That's pretty good science, but I would also recommend you don't ever look for a reason not to plant a tree, even if it's not in the ideal space. If you have an appropriate setting to plant a large tree, go ahead and plant it. You definitely want to streamline your specific strategies if you're trying to reduce air quality or trying to improve air quality on a traffic corridor. You want to be very precise where you're planting, but don't always look for reasons to plant trees, because there's a lot more reasons that people are justifiably using to remove them. That's just the nature of living in a developed place. A lot of those pollutants are carried down by rain also, and then come back into our system. Just look at your trees when we go 2 or 3 weeks without rain. Look at all the stuff on the deciduous leaves in the summertime, not just the pollen, right? But look at all the dust and gradu that's on those leaves. That's normally stuff we would be inhaling. Those trees are directly intercepting that, whether that came down in a rainstorm, the rains evaporated and dried off, or it's being intercepted as we speak.
That was a really good point I'm glad you made, which is a lot of people are coming to me and they're like, oh my God, now I don't know what to plant where, because you're telling me all these different things. And I think what it comes down to, just like you were saying, is these concentrated pollutions, like I was saying, are very microclimatic. It's like once you get 500 feet or a block or so away from the freeway, that's no longer a problem almost. It kind of goes back to an ambient pollution level. And so like you said, we need to be really specific along freeways, or really what we call like dense street canyons, like really tall buildings and urban conditions, because pollution can get trapped. But like you said, everywhere else, let's just get more trees in the ground.
I just have one comment on the trees. I know nothing about trees, just so you know, okay? But having said that, I served as the chief meteorologist for the Hot Air Balloon Festival that played out down at Pennington when it was in Baton Rouge. And I just want the people from Baton Rouge to hear this, as I was blown away by it. All of the balloon pilots were marveling at how heavily treed the city of Baton Rouge is. They say, I mean, it's one of the most heavily treed cities in the nation, okay? Not just Louisiana, but the whole nation. And that was a real take home for me, that appreciate what we got here in Baton Rouge, because it really is pretty special from the perspective of being heavily treed. Because they couldn't find places to land the balloons. It was causing all kind of problems.
I would say appreciate, but don't take for granted. And we do have one of the most robust urban canopies in the state. We are fortunate enough to live in a climate where anything grows, literally. But it doesn't always mean it's going to last forever. And especially in North Baton Rouge, you do see a lot of urban canopy, but the condition that urban canopy in is not nearly as good a condition as stuff that's happening in the Garden District in southern parts of Baton Rouge. So we are extremely blessed to have the urban canopy we do, but a lot of that's based on feral ag land that's being developed as we speak, and a lot of old plantation and farmland down on Burbank. I drove down to Burbank the first time in a couple of years, and like the subdivisions that are going up are insane. It's just a lot of stuff's being cut down really quicker than we can replace it.
Hello. Okay. My question's mainly for Brent, for the last slide that you didn't get to on your presentation. As a mixed methodologist, I was wondering if you could talk about the approach of qualitative methods and how you introduce that into your work, and maybe share a story of how qualitative methods have helped shape some of your projects.
Yeah, that was such a great chunk that I didn't get to. But yeah, exactly. As a scientist, we often like try to focus on the quantitative often because we're like, well, I can control it. It's easier as an environmental engineering firm, right? But I think the interesting thing as for us, for example, it's like we know we can't change everywhere in these communities to improve the condition everywhere just with how much it costs, right? And so for us, the people are critical, right? Not only in that project we're doing in Dallas where we went out and observed where people are walking, and then we actually, a student from the university there went and actually surveyed 40 different people from different places where they work there, from janitors to nurses, and like, how do you actually move around the district? From my own experience, we don't have extreme heat issues. We have pollution issues. We have flooding issues. Like, my house is built in a former wetland, you know what I mean? And what I've found constantly is that, like, community members are the experts, right? Like, they're not trained. I don't have a PhD or an advanced degree either, so can kind of associate with them more. But I'm like, they don't have an advanced degree, but they know way more than the people who say they know everything, right? And I just see, like, one of my neighbors at the corner. He's out every storm we have, and he's like sweeping leaves around from the storm drain. Like, he knows exactly how far deep it floods. He knows why it's flooding, when, and similarly with air pollution, we've worked with a lot of community groups where it's like the grandmother sitting on her porch has the best view of like what traffic's going by. Like, the traffic engineer is going to go out for an hour and do some model of how many cars are there, but like, she has a really intimate knowledge about how and when traffic comes and the pollution. And I often say, like, some of our best air quality sensors are like our nose. It's an amazing sensor. And so I think really honoring those things as true scientific process is important. So those are a couple little ones.
And I think we have time for one more quick question, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
Hi, I'm Darlene with Bretta. We're a nonprofit that works with small farmers, and just wanted to bring up the role the extreme heat is having on not only our people but our food supply. And last year was, our farmers tell us, kind of like the grandmother on the porch. Our farmers that are doing this work have that insight to years and years and decades of experience, and for the first time ever putting seeds in the ground that actually just burn up. So I guess, Dr. Keim, this is really for you, and just wanted you to maybe shed some light on efforts or trends and things in agriculture specifically in our state and the effects that the extreme heat is having on that.
Yeah, well, last summer obviously was one for the record books. So we've never seen anything like a summer like that. So, the folks in the cattle ranching world, the farmers, they were experiencing some things that, literally, they've never seen, their parents have never seen, and probably their grandparents have never seen. So, that event, well, the chances of that event happening again, I would argue, are pretty small, but obviously it happened, so we know it can happen. But the chances of seeing something like that again, I think, are really, really remote. But having said that, we've obviously are going to learn a lot. I'm sure the Ag Center over at LSU is taking this to heart, and hopefully we'll rethink how to move forward based on what we now know is possible in our climate system here. So, I mean, again, that's a little out of my wheelhouse in terms of what specifically is happening, but it's events like this that we learn from and ultimately become more resilient to.
Thank you. And we can't say no to Cordell. So Cordell, do you want to squeeze your question in super quick? I think David has a microphone behind you.
Cordell Heyman, board member of CPEX. One of the goals of this summit every year is to look at different aspects of problems, but also to make connections between them. So I just wanted to comment that we're looking here at the issues involving heat. We're looking at ways to mitigate that. And I think the focus is on where can you plant trees. And I think you need to also think about where can you preserve trees. And this gets to our patterns of development, which should be an overriding thought process on everything that we talk about at the summit, because almost all of the problems that we're talking about could be mitigated tremendously if we had actual planning. We don't have it in Baton Rouge or anywhere around Baton Rouge. And so, you know, you can't blame developers for doing what's right there in front of them to do. But, you know, you used Burbank as a classic example to look out there, which was all trees for miles until 10 years ago. And one by one, those trees are being taken out. And there's no regulatory or other impediments to developing that way, and there are no incentives to do it any differently. So I would just like all of our panels, when you focus on your piece of the elephant, to step back and comment on the rest of the elephant, because you know, we had a panel that preceded you this morning, and everyone there gave this token appreciation to the value of finding out what people want. If you actually educate people, and that's the planning process, to understand the implications of what they want, they will make good decisions. But they don't do that by themselves from a position of really never having thought about it. So, you know, this is just a plug. Baton Rouge needs to have a planning entity. We do not have one. Thank you.
Amen.
Yeah. Yes.
It's a great note to close on. Please help me thank our panelists, Barry, Robert, and Brent. You guys were great. Thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause. And I have a few quick announcements. Remember, if you are here for continuing education credits, you need to check in at the table in the foyer. I want to thank our session sponsor again, the Department of Health and Well Ahead. And right now, I invite you all to head to the lobby and grab your lunch and then come back in here because we have an amazing plenary with Dr. Anne-Christine Duhame. She's going to share insights on neuroscience, decision-making, and planning for environmental sustainability. It will be fascinating, so we'll see you back here shortly.